really look at interactions between organisms. So we'll take a look at some of these different concepts. We're doing this one from home, so you're going to hear the bird. But in this picture, these are just food chains. And so this is an ocean food chain with phytoplankton and zooplankton, and then a small fish and then a larger fish. And this is a land one with grass, grasshopper, bird, and then a hawk. And so at the very bottom of every food chain or trophic level is you have your primary producers. These are your photosynthesizers, okay? They're doing photosynthesis. Then the next level, you have your primary consumers. Or you have your herbivores, okay? These guys are eating the primary producers. Then the next level, you have your secondary consumers, or you have, these are also known as these are your primary carnivores. Okay. Then the last level you can get up to, and you sometimes can get another level up, is the tertiary consumers, or you can get to the secondary carnivores. Okay. Notice that the arrows always point to where the energy is flowing. The energy is going from the small bird to the big bird, or from the small fish to the large fish. The arrows always point in the direction the energy is flowing. Okay. We can turn this into an ecological pyramid. An ecological pyramid is really, it's a pyramid of two things. You're looking at, it's a pyramid of mass, and it's also a pyramid of energy. Okay, a mass or numbers when we say that. Numbers. Okay. So at the bottom where you have your primary producers, we're going to kind of do so this is your primary producer level. We're going to do a little math here. It's not hard math, guys. So at this level, let's just say, for argument's sake, that there's 100 or 10,000 joules. Oh, can't see that part. There's 10,000 joules of energy at this level. Okay, it's just a unit of energy. When these guys get eaten up, when the primary consumers get eaten, they lose 10% of the energy, so it goes down to 100 joules. Then, when these guys get eaten into your primary carnivores or your secondary consumers, we lose 10% of the energy again, and we go down to 100 joules. Okay? And these numbers are kind of ambiguous, but you're seeing the 10% decrease, or the only 10% of the energy is getting transferred. And then when you get into your third consumers, you get down to 10 joules. And then finally at your fourth consumers, and notice that this is a pyramid, you're not going to have a ton of top consumers, or apex predators they call them, because they're at the apex of the triangle, because it's a pyramid of energy, and there's not a lot of energy available for those guys to exist. And you're also not going to have very many in numbers, because there's just not enough stuff there for them to exist. There's not enough food or resources. Okay, so we have it's called the law of 10%. And the question is so 10% of energy is transferred. And now the question is, why? Where does that energy go? Where does the energy go from here to here? Why are we losing energy? So where does energy go? Okay? And the answer is it goes to two places. One is, then the primary one is respiration, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit more. Okay? These guys they're gonna take in energy from the sun, and they're gonna produce a bunch of energy, but they're gonna use some of it for themselves. Okay? These guys, as they eat them, they're gonna use some of it for themselves. It's not all gonna be available for the next level. And the other thing is waste. Okay? they're gonna poop. And they're gonna do things like that. And then the last thing is some of it is actually lost its heat, and that's especially true when you get into the endotherms and animals in that category. Okay, but definitely some of it's lost its heat. But the main ones are respiration and waste products. Let's look at the difference between a food chain and a food web. So a food chain is really just, it's linear, okay? They're very simple. And you're gonna have, so it's linear, it's simple, and it's just one relationship, okay? It's going to go from the corn, notice the arrow pointing towards the cow to the human, okay? You're just going boop, boop, boop. That's it, that's a food chain. A food web shows many complex relationships. Okay, and you can, you're going to see many complex relationships. Notice that you have like the grass, and you could go to the butterfly or the squirrel or the mouse or the rabbit or the grasshopper. And what's kind of interesting is let's look at the frog, for example. He is going to eat the butterfly, and then he gets eaten by things like the coyote, which if the coyote's eating the frog, he is going to be a tertiary consumer, right? Here's the primary, here's the secondary, here's the tertiary. But if he's eating the squirrel, he's only a secondary consumer. He's the primary, he's the secondary. So animals, like the coyote, can be on different trophic levels. And that's because it's a complex food web. So you can see there are some apex predators. This mountain lion is an apex predator in this case. Okay, he is the top of the food chain. Now notice something interesting that occurs here. All of these organisms, if they were to die, they are going to get recycled. Decomposition is occurring here. I wrote that terribly, sorry. Okay, decomposition is occurring here. And these guys are they're not going to recycle energy, but they are going to recycle nutrients. All the energy is coming from sun, remember that? And photosynthesis over here with the grass. But they're going to recycle nutrients, things like nitrogen, and things like phosphorus. Your decomposers are things, this is how I always remember what a decomposer is if you just remember this, FBI. So it's fungus, bacteria, and then the I stands for insects. Those are your primary decomposers in any ecosystem. And we've talked about them as decomposers before. So that's kind of their deal. Okay. A couple other terms and things to talk about from this chapter. These ideas, these gross primary productivity and net primary productivity, we're going to look at in your lab. And we're going to measure them. Gross primary productivity is the total amount of primary production, or photosynthesis, or I guess you could also argue chemosynthesis if you're down in a hydrothermal vent, okay, of primary productivity in an ecosystem. Okay. Now, net primary productivity is probably more important because it's the amount of primary productivity minus the amount used by or used for respiration. The plants have to live. They're producing some energy so that they can live, right? So it's the amount that they produce, the total amount that they produce, minus the stuff that they use. So the net primary productivity is the stuff that's available for the next level, okay? It's the stuff that's still around after the plants have used their energy, okay? So it's so minus the amount used for respiration by plants or by primary producers, because sometimes they're protists or other things, but you get the idea, okay? So it's the amount of primary production minus the amount used for respiration by plants. We're going to see this in a lab setting. We're going to see these two concepts, the net and gross primary productivity. Now, one of the other things that your book talks about is this idea of species richness. And so how many species are available or around in an ecosystem? And it's affected by latitude and climate. Now, if you think about it, what's probably one of the most diverse climates on planet Earth? Coral reefs and tropical rainforests. Where do they occur? Near the equator, okay? So the further you get from the equator, we know that the climate changes more dramatically, right? It gets colder, we have colder winters and warmer summers, and you have the more dramatic changes. So the further you get from the equator, more dramatic climate, all right? And less species richness. It's harder for species to adapt to those changes, and so less of them have done it. And so there's less species in the Arctic, less species diversity in the Arctic than there is at the equator. It's just how it is. Okay? Your book talks a little bit too about this idea of island biogeography, and you're going to do and apply the concepts about how you can repopulate islands. Island biogeography is just really like it's unique habitats because they're isolated. And it tells a lot about ecosystem dynamics. You can see how things get repopulated and how fast things can get repopulated. You can see about how many species are able, how many niches are available for use. It tells about ecosystem dynamics. Apparently I have to do laundry. So it tells about ecosystem dynamics. The other thing that it tells about is the further, just kind of a concept about islands. Further from mainland, less species richness. Okay, there's less species richness. There's less species there. The further you get from the mainland. So Hawaii has less different organisms than Catalina, because Hawaii is way further from the mainland than Catalina. Another concept, your book does not go into this, but the AP people love this concept. You might even want to star it. It's like that important. I don't know why your book doesn't talk about it. It actually is one of the things I hate about your book. Is primary and secondary succession. It's really a simple concept. Here's what happens. In primary succession is you get new land exposed, like from a glacier or created from, like, let's say a volcano or something like that. And so what's going to happen is primary succession is just this process that's going to occur. You're going to get what's called pioneer species that come in. And in where it's new land, these are going to be things like lichen or bacteria. They're going to be your primary pioneer species. And they're going to create soil. They're going to break down the rock. And they're going to create soil. Okay? These lichen and bacteria will eventually be outcompeted by grasses. Okay? And now the grasses are hanging out for a few years, and then you'll start to see small shrubs appear. Okay? Then eventually you'll start to see big shrubs after a few years. And meanwhile, little birds are moving in, and reptiles and amphibians and whatever, okay? And what's also happening is as you start to get shrubs and things, you start to actually see like more water is staying around because there's soil and the roots help hold in the water, and you're starting to see shade, so you're starting to see a little bit of climate changes and things like that. And then eventually you get trees, okay? And then it reaches what's called the climax forest. This is after it's been around for a few years. Secondary succession is an exact similar process, and we're going to get to look at this in class, so don't stress if you're not fully understanding this process, but it's not that complicated. It's just how it is. The difference between primary and secondary succession is, in secondary succession, the soil is already there. Soil is there. This is like, think about, a really common example of one is like after a fire. So there's no organisms there. They're all gone, but the soil's still there. So what your pioneer species is in this case, we don't need those lichen and bacteria to come in and create soil, so we just start with the grasses. So the first thing you'll see after a fire is you'll see grasses. And then you'll start to see the small shrubs. And then then birds start to move in. You'll start to see bigger shrubs, and you start to see some mammals moving in and reptiles and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually you get to the trees and your climax forest again. Okay. The difference between primary is that there's no soil, secondary there is soil, and it's just the process of going and getting bigger.